coming out today. It's my first presentation here to a live audience, so that'll be a lot of fun. Bear with me as I go along.
It's my first presentation here to
We
a
started
live
out today,
audience,
we're
so
going to
that'll
talk
be a lot of
about
fun.
conversational
Bear with me
AI.
as I go along.
So I'm speaking on behalf of Filament, and what Filament does is we help large-scale enterprises manage multiple chatbots. So we have a conversational AI platform that allows you to manage and build and train and then optimize many chatbots to try and save you as much time as possible. As you dive into conversational AI and chatbots, you'll see that it's really, really time intensive to be able to build these things out. So we're going to talk through today's session. We're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to start on the strategic side and look at a more general product management strategy and approach. And then we'll dive into more tactical how we're solving some of the problems that we're facing at Filament today. So we started off by socializing, actually, and I'll come back to these questions later on in the presentation because they'll tie into some of the questions that we use for the discussion points that we have. So there's three main takeaways I would like everyone to be able to get from today's session. First one being, what does the overall process look like? So what is our product lifecycle when it comes to building conversational AI and chatbots? Second one, and more on the tactical side, we're going to go into looking at a deep dive on the pain point definition side of things. So after we've framed the overall strategy and vision for the product, we're going to look at how we define some of our customer pain points well. And this is what we'll work with our data science teams to then look at the third point here on the solutioning deep dive side. So here we want to be able to collaboratively find solutions working across product management, development, data science, and DevOps as well. So feel free to interrupt me at any point in time. We'll want to make this a really interactive discussion. Let's look at the first part of today's presentation. So we're going to look at the overall product management lifecycle. And this is where we define the why, the what, and the how. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot going on here in this slide, but essentially what we're looking at is the overall life cycle of a product, starting from when you first conceive it, so at the inception phase. This is what we call the why phase, as in why are we building this product? What are some of, or which are the pain points that we're trying to solve out there in the market? Why is it important to solve some of these pain points? So we walk through starting on the strategy side, and this is all about understanding the broader market out there and the competitive landscape, and once again, trying to answer the question, is there a problem out there? Is it important to solve? Why is it important to solve? And why does our product exist? Then moving further along the life cycle, we get into what we call the what phase. And this is talking now about what can we do to solve that problem? Like, what will a solution look like? And we start to think about the features that we can deliver in order to solve the problem. At this stage, it's very much still a hypothesis stage. We don't know for sure the features that we build are going to solve the problem, and so we're taking more of an experimental approach. Finally, we get into the how stage, as in like, how are we going to build these features that solve this problem? And this is where we work with development to actually, and as well as data science, to implement what it is that we're building. Then, as you can see, it is an iterative feedback loop, and once you actually launch it out into beta, now is when you can start gathering really, really valuable data that will then validate or disprove your hypothesis. And then also from there, you can start to look at different features you can generate to solve more of the customer pain points that you hear once you're out there in the market. Are there any questions about this slide before I move on?
Yeah, like from evaluate, you get back to research.
Say again?
From evaluate, you get back to research.
So the reason being is you want to then go ahead and research the pain points that you've come across when you're evaluating customer feedback.
Do you really analyze and design new prototypes after that?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do that for each and every single feature initiative that we work on. So typically, once we've launched that in beta, we start to be able to grab more quantitative feedback. Prior to that, it's a lot more qualitative feedback. But then when we're evaluating the quantitative feedback, we then back into understanding how people are using things and talking to them to get more insight on some of their behaviors that we see. For example, let's say they're not using a feature the way we expected them to use it, or they're using something more than we expected. We might then go back to interviewing them and understanding why it is that they're doing the things they're doing. And then, yeah, back around the circle continuously. Cool. All right, let's dive into some of these in more detail. This one I can speak to, especially being a filament. We were going through a build out of one of our newer products, our conversational AI platform, that we're calling EBM, which is Enterprise Bot Manager. A lot of time was actually spent understanding whether we had a good fit between our product and the market needs. So for example, this is a typical roadmap for a product manager to take as they go along understanding product market fit of their product. You start with defining who your target customer is. So here's where you want to understand, what does your customer look like? What's their profile like? How big or small are they? Who's the buyer and the user? And you're seeking to ask a lot of other questions that'll help you better understand like the persona that you're solving challenges for. Next, you're starting to look at their underserved needs. So what are some of those challenges that this ideal customer or target customer has? And with that, you're now starting to fill out the market side of the product market fit. As you work your way higher up the triangle, you're now starting to understand on the product side, what are you going to build to service this market so you can fit and then have a well-scaling, sellable, valuable product. Looking at the product side, you're looking at establishing what your value proposition is. So what's the unique differentiator that you bring to the table, your product brings? Then you're looking at your feature set. So you've defined your value proposition and the pain points you're solving. What are the ideal features that you can put out there that will actually deliver value and solve those pain points? And then finally, wrapping it all together is a user experience. You can deliver value with your features, but it's not going to be capitalized or realized if the user experience doesn't actually enable you to realize that value easily in an intuitive way. Next, we'll go into the design and prototype phase. So this is typical product management, I'll call it just process. You start with your roadmap and your themes. So these are like the high level pain points you want to solve. What are the main pain point or problem areas your customers are having? And then you want to be able to break that down into your prioritized backlog of stories and epics. There's different ways to prioritize. It really comes down to your company, but yeah, I always strive for something that's more quantitative. So you want to try and quantify the business value that the feature or epic has, and then you also quantify the effort to deliver that. And then you want to get a sense of, how much value are we getting per point of effort? As you get into the prioritized list of backlog epics or stories, there are going to be some items that we're not sure of what's the best way to deliver them, as in what's the best user experience to give someone an ability to use this feature. And so for those items, we would typically bring them through a design prototype test phase where we would try several different designs and then gather some feedback on those designs and see which one makes more sense to our target customers. Now, for the items that we know more about them and how they're used, we don't have to go through that process, and we can bring them right to the sprint backlog, where we break them down into dev tasks and we assign them to the team. Any questions on this stuff so far? Yeah.
What would the prototype phase look like?
In case of, sorry, a model, say it again?
So a model is powering how the product experience renders or whatnot.
Okay.
What does the model prototype look like as opposed to a full product? Like what would be the distinction?
I haven't seen one out there. Sure. You said in the case of a model instead of a visual prototype, what would that look like? How do you understand how it works and how it's used? Yeah, go ahead.
A prototype can look in many different ways, right? So the one that I like is a UI that visibly shows what the functionality is. Doesn't matter what's going on under the hood at the first stage. But now, if you want to look at if UI isn't important to you, you want to have a core technology, you want to have a baseline at the very least that to some extent tackles the tasks that you have at hand. And as long as it does reasonably well, it can be your first prototype, something that you can also do. So there are a lot of considerations as to what that needs to be. You can't just develop something and put it up there and say, hey, that's my prototype. That prototype has to have a life cycle, and you need to know what will follow it in the next version and versions, right? And how are you going to be where you want to be in a long term and mid term, as opposed to just the short term.
So sort of a amorphous question, but I was thinking about the process of prioritizing a backlog or prioritizing features that you want to develop, especially when you're starting from something where like almost nothing exists. And it seems like it would be sort of the value that each brings would interact a lot with the order in which things are developed, right? Like there may be something that is like extremely valuable, but you can't even get there until you've developed these lower level things that have less value.
Yeah.
And I was wondering either now or when you dive into your process, if you could speak to that, like figuring out how you map out that development process when there are like nonlinear dependencies on the different features in terms of their values.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, look, I can cover that now. To that point, I think at that point it's about looking at the strategic roadmap. So not every single thing will have a quantifiable value is what it is. Instead, what we'll do is look at it more holistically and say, well, okay, this is maybe like a value point of 5, but this other thing that's maybe like a 20 won't be able to get done unless this 5 gets done. So it's just about understanding the whole roadmap end to end and looking at that vision for the product. A good way of doing that actually is starting with the end. So you start with the vision, you understand what your ideal demo or ideal workflow is, and then you work backwards from there and try and plug in the features that you need to get to that. And that's another way to try and tackle that.
Like literally map out different paths you could take to get there?
Different feature paths, I would say. So like as in, you want to get to a certain workflow, it has like 4 different features, of which some of them need to be done in a certain order. If they can't get to their ideal end state and unlock that value that they get from the product if it doesn't have these 4 features. And so you have to put them in a certain order to give them that value from the product.
And then sometimes just like riskiness or the chance of being able to even solve a certain problem that probably has
and I factor that into the other side. The risk or like risk as well as development effort or unknown risk is on the other side of the equation. So you have the value side and then the risk or the effort side. And that factors into there.
Thanks.
All right. The last part here is on the how side and the implementation side. I have a little bit less experience with this part, but essentially this is your traditional agile development cycle. So you're looking at moving things through the sprint and traditional stand-ups in the sprint, and then you ship out a product increment. The idea is that you have something shippable at the end of every single sprint increment, so you can then start to see, is stuff working or is it not working, and then pivot if you need to. So that is the overall product management lifecycle and approach. I think at this stage you want to open it up for some more discussions and start some of the discussion points we had. So we've covered how product management works, but we haven't talked as much about where data science fits into this process. And I think we'd like to open up the floor for that and hear from you guys some thoughts about where you see data science playing into this process that we have here. So open the floor. I don't know if you guys want to start. Maybe tell me about some of the things you talked about in the circles, the socialization circles. Someone's got to have some ideas. Okay, go ahead.
So, when we're dealing with AI or anything that's very data science driven, there's a lot of technical details, and I think a lot of the decision-making people in these, in the clients or the corporations or whoever you're working with, like often don't have that level of technicality, and because we're in this like transition phase where data science is like really exploding. So how do you, in talking with them and getting these requirements and pain points, how do you decide how technical you should be with the clients and what their expectations are, and what your expectations are in terms of meeting together in terms of like conceptually what we need and technicality in the technical detail what we need?
Sure. I think what we've seen, especially with conversational AIs, is that there's a big expectations gap, as you just mentioned. Like people think that chatbots can actually replace human beings, but when you actually go and build a chatbot, you learn that you have to tell it what to say, which all of a sudden is like half of the things that a human does. Sure, chatbots can understand. Even then, they still take a lot of hand-holding in the beginning to be able to understand a lot of the things that people can understand right away. So to that effect, I think what I found really useful is taking them through a demo of our actual product and showing them the steps it takes to build a performance chatbot, and just seeing, like, for example, the amount of utterances you need to put inside there. For anyone who doesn't know, utterances are examples of a way that someone could ask a question to a chatbot. So there's like you'd have to put in, let's say you want to order a pizza, you could type to the chatbot, I'd like to order a pizza, but if you said, hey, I'd love a pizza tonight, it might not understand what you're saying. So you have to put in different variations of what it is you're trying to ask the chatbot. Now, for each of the questions one of your customers could ask the chatbot, you might have to put in like 25 different ways of asking the question, which takes a long time.
If you're not using ML.
Yeah. Okay. So the idea is like the utterances are then, the bot can expound on what you've said, but it still needs at least a baseline amount of utterances to get started.
Yeah, and even if you are using ML, then you probably still miss a few utterances because you can't cover every generative way humans possibly speak. So you have to have a way to redefine.
In terms of now back to where the data science fits in here, I think what I've seen, well, I guess right now with our first iteration of the product, we only brought in data science, I think a little bit too late. We brought them in after our beta launch and when we were evaluating some of the data. But I think there's an opportunity to bring them in earlier in perhaps the research phase. And I know you've talked about that before. And your guys' teams, where do you see, or where do you get brought into product initiatives or new concept ideas? At which stage of their development process are you coming in and having conversations?
So I guess we're really lucky. I work at a company called Assurance. We're hiring. We're really lucky because we have our C-level, all champions, data science. So we're right at the strategy stage before it even gets into the loop.
Okay.
We're really lucky in that case, and so every part of the way, data science gets their fingers involved, or fingers in the pie, which is really nice to do. I was also wondering, I guess as a product manager, like maybe when you're not in the ideal data science company, we're hiring. Like how do you manage expectations? Because as soon as a chatbot or something potentially says something wrong, that could also then lose the trust of whoever's the big boss who's demanding results to allow you to take those risks for going down that one feature road.
That's fair. It's a good question. It's actually something we haven't had to struggle with, given like our CEOs are very much from big data science companies like IBM, and also, I lost my train of thought there. Could you repeat the question again? Maybe it'll trigger it.
I guess maybe
I'll bring it up to the root.
Both work for great companies.
Yeah, we're hiring.
When you're building a feature, the chatbot, could say something incorrect. As a user, maybe a non-technical user, you're going to lose complete faith in the machine learning, in data science. And if all the good features have that involved, how do you stop upper management saying, no, we're not doing that. We're doing a couple of if-else statements. We're just going to do this.
Dan, you had a point?
I think a big thing on that is to make sure that upfront the expectations are very clear, and kind of the expectations are clear not only at the end of the project, but at every stage of the project. So for a chatbot project, we can spin up a chatbot in a week, but that chatbot is going to be fairly, quote unquote, dumb, for lack of a better word. It won't be able to understand as many questions. And if you're upfront with the client, a lot of times actually we'll get the client to just hammer a bunch of questions at it. Just anything you can think of regarding the content that we want to have this chatbot be trained on, hammer questions at it. And at the end, on our end, we can actually use those questions to inform and add utterances and train the chatbot to make sure to understand them going forward. But the expectation piece, I think, is the most important part. And kind of, stage one of the project is this, and this is what it'll look like. This is what you'll actually have your hands on, and then kind of build on that as you go on. Because at that point, they're buying into the performance at each stage rather than expecting something that they're not actually going to get. And that can be tough sometimes with ML projects because of kind of how experimental they are. And sometimes things just don't work, right? The data is bad, or it doesn't fit, the use case doesn't fit the problem. But the more upfront you are with the client, especially clients who don't quite understand data science, then the more likely you are to not kind of encounter that wall and have to kind of go down a different path, or even, lose the business, right? It is a risk being that upfront, but you're better off of being upfront about it than getting down the line and being asked questions about, what did I spend the money for if it's not delivering what I was expecting it.
So undersell and over-deliver.
Exactly. To a certain point, yeah. Or even, be very clear about what you will deliver at every point.
Yeah. I'd say you would want to have also a ranked, since you talked about the errors, error types. You would want to have a few categories and say, okay, this is just gonna destroy the company, so this must not happen. And within the tech development, you can make sure that such and such, either depending on what technology you use, may never occur. And then you can have some allowable. Okay, it's gonna be lousy for 2 seconds. It's gonna just do a light swear at this person, but then after that, things are gonna be okay. So that's what I would definitely do, because once you delve into the machine learning and deep learning, then everything can kind of happen, and you have to have measures to stop them from happening. But I would also quickly add some thoughts. So we talked about this in sort of in length. Maybe this helps better to have the discussion. I'm not sure how long you want to spend on this from now on, but very quickly, so would you want to say where you wanted to put it, and then I would say my perspective? I think that works better, and then we have 2 views, and then we can have people comment on.
Yeah, sure. Actually, so I think what we've done is we've put it in the evaluate stage after we've launched the process.
Because I don't see
Oh, sure. It's the voice appearing from nowhere. Yeah, so we've put it here currently. I think it should go in the research and analysis, somewhere in between these phases. Yeah. Oh, sure. Data science being involved. Where should data science jump into the circle and be involved in the conversations and defining the features that we're kind of building out there? Yeah. So the reason that I'd said that to put it in, research and analysis is, at this point in time, if we can collect some quantitative feedback and some data that we can get our hands on, then perhaps that can then drive some of the features that we want to do. But your point was about bringing it earlier.
So I had so much a little bit of a more spread out sort of view of it. I was like, you never know. You may actually, so you don't go to a data science and say, hey, I want to build a company. I don't exactly know what. Could you help me? So that's obviously like the initial state for the strategy. You don't want to include the data scientist, perhaps not a data scientist, but once you went through the cycle once, you want to refine your strategies, right? And there, I think the data science can jump in. Maybe not as extensive as where you would need, analysis or research or design and prototyping, but just so that they're in the loop, they may actually be able to contribute much. But I agree with you that the meat of the contribution of the data scientist would be in seeing. So let me in the research analysis and I would say even design. So I would say it's a little bit of a transient sort of approach. Yeah. So I would see the data scientists being involved in the research, analysis, design, and prototype and production to an extensive manner. The rest of them a little bit just so that they can input because let me put it this way. You will have a better understanding of your product's roadmap when you know the technical restrictions that exist in the technology. So I would say, but not as extensive as elsewhere. So that's my opinion. But I would like to hear what people think if you want to spend more time on this.
Yeah, I kind of actually would love to rephrase the question. Sorry, I keep seeing your hand pop up. For everyone in the room, I've worked with data scientists and ML engineers, and some of them are like, I want to know what's going on. Like, what product are we building? What problems are we solving? Like, I really want to have input early on. And I've worked with other people who are like, don't tell me anything. Just like tell me what I should be doing. Like, I need to focus on my task. And like, if you define the goals, I can get this job done well. But like, if you start talking about all this other stuff, it's like very confusing. And I don't really know what I'm doing. projects start sprawling all over the place. And so I personally worked with people on both sides of that, and I kind of wonder from people who do like data science or ML in this room, like where you guys fall on that, or if there's another way of looking at it too.
Yeah, back here. Great.
I worked on a data science team at a tech consulting company for a little while, so I can't be like overhiring, so I'm not there anymore. But I feel both of those ways. Like I personally like having some input in the beginning to help define what's realistic in strategy, and I like also sort of tracking those conversations, because the better you understand the business process, the better you're going to be able to help develop the solution downstream. But I also know that I personally have a limit where I'm like, can we stop talking about data science and actually do something? I'm going to lose it. But if you have a consulting company or something where you're doing a whole lot of that, I don't think the fact that I can't handle being on all of those projects at the moment means that you should have someone there, right? So I would argue really strongly for having someone who has a like reasonably deep technical data expertise in the strategy part, in the research part, like throughout. Maybe not at every single meeting, but like touch points, making sure things make sense. That you don't like go off on a tangent that really just doesn't make any sense from a like data perspective.
Right.
But then make sure you have the right people who aren't going to like burn out on talking to clients about the project that they want to eventually do but don't get to do.
Yeah.
I think I mostly agree with what you were saying, but I think it's also the team manager also needs to decide what they want, right? Do they want their data scientists to be fully involved in the business aspect as well, or do they want someone who's just going to read their Jira ticket, do what it says, move it over? And so I think that's very, it's down to the manager and the company culture of what they want. I also think in the evaluation, data scientists definitely need to be there, because most people are data illiterate, and so they think one number being higher was always better. Yeah. And so I think they should be in every part. The people who want to be in every part.
Right, there's three questions,
yeah.
right? It's like who do you want on your team as a team composition? Yeah. Well, 3. Where do you need data expertise, and then who should be the person to be involved, or like 3 separate, but like.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're evaluating your product based on data metrics,
yeah,
you have to have someone there who's data literate. Or
I like that. Yeah, I like that one, and I think that's also where you started, because if you want to see how it's performing, how else would you? And also where you're going after that. So it makes this error. Now, how do you want to fix it? Right? What's the?
As a caveat, I would just make sure you don't go to them after you release the product and put it into production, because you're not recording the data correctly, and then you say, oh, like what happened over the last week? You're like, well, you've actually been like overwriting the data in place. Like, yeah. You haven't recorded snapshots of state. He said, yeah, engineering sometimes.
I don't do that.
No. Sorry. Software engineering that puts things into production without notifying the data team of changes that are coming and how we can adequately capture their data in the state that they need it to be to evaluate it according to the strategy is like one of the #1 issues that at least we face in a production environment where there's simultaneous code deployments. Our new features being deployed without the data science team being involved early enough to actually like architect it and engineer the capture of the data over time, time series is a really big issue that I think a lot of companies.
Did you find like, is it the product management team or is it the data science team or development team that's driving that conversation, like bringing those parties together?
That's a good question. I feel like, at least in our situation, a lot of our data science team is in Toronto, where the engineering is in Seattle. So I think actually like a geographical divide makes it more difficult to coordinate. But I think as we provided feedback to management, engineering and data science are collaborating more. So it's good.
Out of curiosity, when people are giving answers that have examples of from their own experience, can you comment on either what company you're at or like what your company does or something? Because I think that would be really interesting for context for the answers.
Sure. Do you want to know what we do?
Yeah.
So Assurance is it's basically a cloud-based insurance sales and marketing platform. So Insurance carriers offer their products on it, but the carriers don't sell it themselves. We have an on-demand contractor workforce, much like Uber drivers. So these agents log in on their computers and they say, I'm available. And our marketing and sales engine is finding people who are interested in insurance at that moment and then basically matching supply and demand.
Sorry, can I suggest that if you want to do that, this session is going to go until the morning?
I wanted to clarify that the reason why I was asking is because I think that understanding like just one line about what kind of data is being collected or like what kind of problem data science might be, like a little bit of color around.
Yeah, my concern is that it's going to go on forever. So can we keep that for the social parts?
Yeah, we have a break coming up soon, by the way, after this slide.
Yeah.
We're halfway through.
Okay.
Yeah?
Did you want to have the break then?
Yeah, we can have a break and now we can chat about it. But yeah, 5 minutes to catch your breath or whatever, have a drink. Yeah, sure.
I was wondering, like, basically starting for a new company, let's say you want to develop this, right? What's the data? Do they have anything? And like, is it kind of like part of incentivizing that, like, okay, we're gonna make you a simple chatbot, but we're gonna collect data because like when you have that, people are gonna try.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. I mean, I know a lot of products out there use that same strategy. For our company specifically, that one doesn't work for us because we believe that our clients should own their own data and their IP. So we actually don't own their intellectual property, nor do we have access to their data. But to the point about having the data, so essentially what our approach is and our plan is build out an MVP with as little customer data as possible. We try and get to a complete end-to-end solution and put it out there in the market. From there, then we can start to interview clients and get feedback. But I think if you had a different application where it was not centered around the fact that you have these enterprise clients with very stringent data policies and you were able to collect their data in exchange for giving them maybe a free tool, I think that's a great strategy. And we've seen it work elsewhere, like the biggest internet companies do that. Actually, maybe you guys from Delphi do something similar, or do you not do something similar along those lines? So the question was like, at the beginning of creating a product, let's say, and it's a data science type of product that involves data science, you don't have the data necessary to actually build a proper solution. So is it effective? And have you seen cases where you'll build a small free tool with the value exchange being that in return you'll get some data from them to then give them some more value later?
Okay, Jake, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know because I haven't touched any of this. But I think you've done some stuff with preliminary surveys that might be what you're talking about.
And product has done the same with growth. I work with surveys. We design them, we pilot them, we get a panel cross-sectionally, people that are balanced demographically, to answer the question so we have some data before we go live to our users. We also have people do user testing, which is the qualitative research. You bring on somebody to go through an experience, I guess, and they commented along the way. I want to comment that we do pre-registration, which is totally like before we get data, we define our goals, we scope them down. It's either exploratory or it's confirmatory. So we can create hypothesis before we get the data so we know we really want to solve this problem. We're going to make our if statement, our then statement, and then when we actually get the data and run it, we can actually go, let's prove it. Instead of, because data science gets super like convoluted and crazy. So we do pre-registration as well. I want to bring that up. Does that answer anything?
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I have one more question. So is this data like basically task specific, or like you have like a bunch of data and just like train some chatbot which can answer questions?
Maybe define a little bit more. What do you mean?
So basically, you know, for example, if you're a bank, right, you expect some kind of questions, and if you're like, I don't know, online ordering, you expect other type of questions, right?
Yeah.
So basically, do we have like, I don't know, pool of data for each of those? Or
I think so. That speaks to the data science side of things. So I think it depends. That's the the answer that I don't like to give, but that really depends on the situation. If you have different clients, in different markets, maybe it doesn't make sense to merge the data. But to contradict just that, if you have a lot of data, you can train a general machine, then as a general sort of chatbot, conversational agent. We can learn to specific domains, fine tune it to specific domains. So it really depends on the scenario, what industry you are, so on and so forth.
So it's a really good question because it segues into what we're going to cover next, which is a feature that's built to help us do some of that that you're talking about. In terms of like the deep dive and the focus on business value, actually before I jump into that, I want to set a little bit of context about our application, and some of the constraints that we're facing and why we took a certain approach to our data science at Filament. Number one is that we're an enterprise B2B app. What that comes with is like less access to data as easily as other companies. We make our clients are big clients. Is this a disco? Like. Oh. So yeah, our clients are big and tend to hold on to their data like gold, as they should. Second is that we're, to your point, your question earlier, we're also in the early stages of market adoption. So we don't have as much access to data as we would like. So given that, and now touching on the question you'd asked, some of the big pain points that we get from customers are, number one, around finding the best customer queries and actions for our chatbot to handle. So to your point about if you're a bank versus you're taking, let's say, pizza orders or something, a lot of times when you're building out your first chatbot, you don't know, what are all the different situations I have to handle. And here I'm kind of walking through two main pain points. This first one around finding the best intents to include, and then the second one is around the continuous manual training time required to actually support and maintain an engaging chatbot, a chatbot that can understand what users are saying. And that involves a lot of manual training time and a lot of adding manual utterances that we mentioned before. So these are a couple of the big pain points that we're coming across in our product right now. And this is essentially how we went through identifying them, is asking customers these sort of questions. So for example, like, why do they have a chatbot? And what kind of questions is that chatbot dealing with? Why is it dealing with those questions as opposed to other ones? How do they decide which questions it should answer? And all this is driving at the fact that, let's say you're a traditional, large business that makes widgets, and you're not really sure, or you don't have it documented in a structured way, all the questions that have been asked by your customer service department on, like, I'm trying to open my widget and I'm unable to do so, and now it's breaking down. So that sort of data you don't have in a structured way. So currently, like, some of our users are actually just going through manually chat logs and reading about the questions asked and understanding, what are the kind of questions that a chatbot needs to cover. Or they're speaking to their customer service agents who might not be super receptive to helping them, given that they could be replacing their jobs. So that's another issue that we kind of find. Then now looking further along and understanding that pain point, you're going to get a lot of pain points and issues or feature requests thrown at you as a product manager, and it's important for you to evaluate them. And a big part of that is understanding the impact of that pain point. Like, is it useful and valuable to solve this problem? So for us, we tried to really understand and quantify the impact that this problem would have for our target customers. So for example, when it comes to building out a chatbot and understanding what are the best intents to include in that chatbot as our base set of intents or questions the chatbot should be able to handle answering, we found that it was taking, we don't have the actual figures here, but it took a significant amount of numbers spent per chatbot. And that was just with one chatbot. And some of these companies are massive and they have like 8 or 10 chatbots, and it adds up to quite a bit of money. But the bigger value driver is actually what happens after that. If you're able to cover most of the ways that your customers can ask a question and all the different questions they can ask, then you're handing off less and less questions to your customer service representatives, and you're driving down the costs of your contact center. So ideally, you want a chatbot that can handle a lot of the basic questions, or maybe some of the more time-consuming questions, but some of the stickier or trickier or questions that need to be handled with delicate care, those are the ones you want your customer service agents to be handling. So it was important to understand that the metrics we're driving at are reducing the time it takes to train the chatbot, to build it up, and then reducing the containment rate, which is the rate at which something is handled end-to-end by a chatbot instead of being handed off to a human agent. To that first point above, this is a great way that we use to illustrate this problem. When you create a chatbot, you're looking at the frequency of questions, so how often is someone going to ask, I'd like to order a pizza, to like Domino's chatbot, versus how many different ways can they ask different questions. And that is what your long tail is here. So ideally, you obviously want to be able to cover the short tail, the most frequent questions, as easily as possible, but there's going to always be that long tail of questions, and it's too laborious and maybe not worth it in some cases to start covering more of these long tails. What we want to be able to do is, and our customers have told us, is how do we figure out which of these long tails are over here, which of the questions in the long tail are like here versus here, which ones should we actually start to cover, and can you make it easier for us to actually build these into our chatbot? So that's the pain point that we're looking at solving over here. Here's where I'll open up to discussion again and ask you about some of the ways that you uncover, pain points to solve in your organizations, and then also more, in addition to that, how you quantify the value of solving those things. So do we have any other PMs in the audience here, or maybe anyone else who wants to start talking about how they solve these problems? Yeah.
So what I usually do is that I spend a lot of time talking to business. I guess the way we used to work was in more like a consulting model, and then we transitioned into a product model. And that transition was painful and bloody, and it still is. But essentially, what we do is that we spend a lot of time talking to business. That's essentially my job definition, to be meeting with the business. But the thing that we do differently now compared to when we used to do consulting is that before it was a one-to-one translation of this is the pain point, this is the way to tackle it. But right now it is like collect a lot of pain points from everyone and then figure out what can you build that tackle as many of the pain points as possible. That's a much slower development cycle. But the business partners are usually much less happier with that because they're not getting the direct attention. But in the longer term, that's an investment that you can put in and hopefully build something that is significantly more scalable and reusable.
Yeah, I could see that, especially if you're going to pull them all together and then you're going to judge and prioritize which ones you want to tackle. Are you also obviously you're looking at this point, like which data you have available for each solving some of these challenges? Do they come to you with that?
I mean, we should. We don't do as much as, I guess my product is an NLP product, which is, you can usually get a pretty decent baseline that you can, start a conversation with them based on general English language models. But then, we don't need to see their data pretty far into the process of development. Because, as long as we can adapt later, as long as the product is modular enough and has retraining, refinement, whatever is required to adapt to their data, can go pretty far. I don't think that's going to work for other types of product necessarily, but in NLP, it usually works pretty decently.
Yeah.
I'll speak again.
Please.
I like my own voice, I guess. At our company, we kind of have like a two-pronged attack to find pain points. So we kind of have like the product managers who take the qualitative approach. They talk to the users, they go that way, and then basically the data team looks at the data, see where users are dropping off at what points, and then the data team becomes more qualitative, the product managers become more quantitative, and then together they strategize. That's one. And then they kind of work out what data do we need. Do we have the data that we need already? How do we go about getting the data we need to solve this problem?
I really like that.
I thought that was.
Approach.
I like that approach.
Yeah, I find it helps finding the high leverage points. So if the product managers come with this qualitative feedback, and then data science comes with a little more technical expertise and sort of an understanding of what's realistic given the constraints of the problem, we find that we can get to a really effective and simple solution. Doing getting it at 80%, like 20% of your effort. So.
Yeah. And what about in terms of defining that evaluation or like the impact of the business? Is that something you guys will do together? Or is that your product management team that brings it, and then maybe?
Yeah, it would be product manager and data science working actually with engineering, because typically these things would happen in a production environment. So actually doing like a sort of quantitatively sound A/B test, sort of random splits, and identifying what would be like a significant lift versus random variation is kind of how we all coordinate.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is it's almost like pods. So there would be like a pod of product manager, someone from a data team, someone from the engineering team, who have all kind of naturally taken ownership of some user role, let's say user engagement on page X.
Yeah.
Naturally it comes out that way, and then they're always talking, they're always kind of bouncing ideas off each other on how to improve it and what would have the biggest ROI. Yes. Yeah, I know that's not always the case in every company.
I like that it's centered. You have this pod. It sounds like with this one key, like North Star metric or whatever they're trying to drive towards, and there's all the different ways you can try and solve that that problem. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I just want to maybe pose a question related to this.
Yeah.
But so, if you have a more analytical machine learning algorithm, it's very easy to define. Like you have a false negative that has a certain cost, a false positive. I feel like in chatbot, I don't do them, but to me it seems like okay, you can look at retention rate or like not having to forward to a human employee, but there's a lot of other types of errors that you spoke about. So maybe if you could speak about how some of those might be very hard to measure, and some of those would be hard to quantify in terms of the cost. So maybe people that are working that could.
I can quickly start that off and maybe pass it over to you guys. But I think an easier one for data science to measure would be the performance or the confidence score the chatbot has of understanding an intent. But something that's more significant or impactful to the business might be that containment rate or conversion of a customer from the onboarding into like actually using whatever it is their product does. But let me turn it over to you. I think you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's kind of one of the core problems, right? Is like, how do you measure something that's so kind of qualitative in a certain way, and also where you don't get a lot of good signals. And I think there's a lot of inference. We can talk about like customer satisfaction and like trying to measure that, but most people aren't going into like a chatbot and being like, oh, I want to review like every single thing and like give you all this feedback and give you good signals. And so I think there's a lot of inference, and I think there's like a fine art, right, to kind of figure out what the pain point is, kind of what is the actual problem behind it. I find a lot of times people think they have a pain point and they don't actually really know what the pain point is. Because they're too hung up on like a certain feature or a certain number, right? And I go back to this example a lot when I used to work in bike shops, like in college, and we had this customer come in and he had like this mountain bike from like Walmart or something. He was like, I want to take my kid for a ride. I want you to install this like baby thing seat on the back of this bike. And we had to be like, we cannot do that. Your baby will die. Like, this is like not something you should do. But obviously that's like the wrong way to tell them. And like, I think the art in it is saying like, you're hung up on this feature. What you really want to do is go on a bike ride with your kid. And there's other options of how to do this. And similarly with chatbots, right? People get hung up on containment rate. That's the industry standard. And any of us here could have 100% containment like tomorrow just by making it impossible to get to an agent, right? Like, it's like the easiest way of doing it. But obviously that's a terrible experience. And I think that the customers and the clients will often get hung up on these metrics, and you have to have a little bit of time to step back and say, okay, what do you really want to do? And what are other ways of handling that? Do we want to measure like how many times are your customers returning to this product, to this help support within the same day, for example? Maybe they didn't get their problem solved. Is this a better thing to look at? Or sometimes it's feature specific about how you want to measure the success of that feature as well.
Can I just say that was a really good answer? I just really like that answer.
Did you try to put a baby seat on your bike as well?
I mean, I guess something that can be quantified is if you go with my earlier sort of assumption that you hopefully can rank a few categories of errors that your bot could take, and then take a look at, and let's say every time you connect the bot to an agent, it's a miss for the bot, right? If we say that, then we can actually try to quantify, post-analyze what are the cases that my bot is missing on, and what's the quantity of each case, right? And if you have done your ranking and rating, you probably can get one measure that can tell you, okay, this is what I need to fix first. But I think you can do that post-analysis to sort of quantify what, at the current state, what are the customers suffering from as well.
Yeah. And that actually, your point on that is a big part of what a chatbot product manager does. So people that are clients who are responsible for running their chatbot programs, like they're always focused on how do we figure out where the chatbot's going wrong, and yeah, what are those metrics? Because like, yeah, it's a good point. The containment rate is something that has a lot of other factors. Like if you have a small intent set, then it's easier to, for the person to bounce onto a real agent versus a large intent set, but then it's less understood. Yeah, definitely. It seems like that's like the constant challenge of chatbot product managers actually, is finding that like the right metric to measure. Do anyone else have any thoughts on that? Have you guys found any good metrics and stuff too? Yeah.
So I assume this is like anything else where like the answer is usually just try a whole bunch of them, right? Like there's probably not one metric that's like this is the metric you want. You probably have to assess a whole bunch. I was thinking about how you would make them useful. There's an aspect of it that's just like if you have different versions of your model, how are you doing on that metric? Are you improving? And then there's an aspect of it that's like error analysis. Like if you can cluster your errors, you can do like manual assessment of it. But I'm wondering whether we were kind of talking about this before too. I'm wondering whether there are other things you could do with it, and like how often you can actually go from having some metric to like model retraining without having it be a super manual process where someone is like, oh, I see there's a problem here. Let's collect data that's specific to this problem.
That's a good question.
Like as in, if I'm understanding correctly, do you mean like finding which of those errors you need to fix? Is that what you meant?
Well, you can like have some metric that helps you point out specific errors. You can look at them manually and say, oh, I see a pattern. We're failing in this general use case. Let's try to address this use case, which is like manual error analysis. But I'm wondering if there are examples of metrics or just examples, like experiences people have had with chatbots, where there's something where they actually can use it to like consistently flag data that can go into a like model retraining pipeline. Where you're like, oh, this is good, or oh, this is now an example that should feed something, or whatever.
So like an online learning kind of thing.
Yeah, or like.
But weighted on the errors more than.
Yeah, or online, or like easy way of collecting a new data set to retrain, even if it's happening downstream. Or like maybe there's a broader question of like how else can you use those metrics to improve your model besides like the manual error analysis process and the general like assessment of your model iterations. Yeah, so I think there are a few points in there, and each sort of a little bit of a different vertical. They connect in that you're kind of referring to AutoML. You're saying that if you have a machine learning algorithm, why do I have to jump in every time that I want? Why do I have to manually decide if it's working where, it's not working where, and where should I fix, and how often should I fix, right? And that's part of steps towards that.
Yeah, and that's an important part of any sort of if you have an ML team, you're supposed to also have a model verification, model validation team. That part of their job would be automate like change detection, if it's working well with the data, if your model is still representative of the features of your data, how the distribution of the data has changed, and then trigger hopefully a retraining.
But you're saying if it's still working well, so like that gets back to like, so what metrics end up being?
So that's the part that I'm evading. But I did want to plan. So there were a few, right?
Yeah.
So this part I leave it for the open discussion because there are quite a few, and I'd like to hear other people's thoughts. But just want to say that part. That the answer.
Cool clarification.
Yeah, so my thoughts are, I think we focus on success criteria and those metrics of how we know something is succeeding. And I come from a linguistics background in my PhD work. I didn't finish, but and I think, but a lot of engineers too, I think, we're kind of trained to break things, right? Like you give me something and I want to break it. And I think it's useful because, in designing a feature, you're not just designing like how you want it to work right, but if that's where all the edge cases come in. If you can really upfront kind of decide like, oh, how many different ways can I break this feature and kind of anticipate that, then you can at least start like figuring out how to track the ways that it can be broken, right? And so like with intent classification for a chatbot, like the criteria of success is like, can we recognize what they're trying to say? But we know there's like millions of ways of breaking that, right? And we know that sometimes somebody will ask something that's just like unrelated, out of scope, like wrong business for some reason. And then sometimes like the cat walked across the keyboard, and that's just like a completely different situation. Both of those are not recognized, but ahead of time, if you're thinking like, how many ways can I break our system? And you think like, okay, there's going to be like out of scope, and then there's going to be like true garbage that we should never actually understand. Then you can start at least hoping to classify those things, and you'll know to like in the things that aren't succeeding, those will at least be a little bit more organized, I think.
Is it? All right, that was a good. I was waiting for you to be like yes, no.
Oh, like the source, like can you give some examples of things that you can measure where you're like, oh, this suggests that the cat block is a keyboard, and this suggests that we got their intent wrong, or responded to, which actually that's another interesting question. Like, there's did you get the intent right, and did you respond appropriately? And you probably can't disentangle those most of the time.
Yeah, I think the short answer is I don't have a good answer for that. And I think it's this kind of like ensemble of looking at different things and trying to piece a story together.
Yeah.
I think just very quickly, I think the best approach for it to be sort of kind of retroactive, because like the space is so big that you possibly it's hard to possibly predict everything that can go wrong for a specific case. So I would say that part of it. So a change detection algorithm can possibly detect, oh, this is something odd going on, or it's an anomaly. Now let's study it. Or if you can have some mechanism to train things. But then if you want for that part to be automated, you need to decide on a signal that will help you refine your model, which is not usually straightforward. So I would in general say that's post-analysis. Yeah.
I think this is a really good question. We haven't found a solution to it either, actually. Ours is the same as yours. Like, we either classify as you've matched an intent, or you haven't matched an intent, or you've matched the wrong intent. And like, that's pretty much all we have at this stage. Some of the features we're looking at are to help us understand where we're going wrong. We're not covering that in this presentation, but I think there is an opportunity there to like maybe use some machine learning, like you said, to help us understand if where we went wrong is really an issue and if we need to solve it or not, in terms of the chatbot understanding what people are saying to it. What I want to talk about here is focusing on that first pain point, which is this one. So in terms of finding, what are those best intents to include in the chatbot? There's a couple of different ways that we thought of solving this based on some of these success metrics you're looking at here. But so the use case and the pain point we're presented with was, okay, well, I don't know the high ROI intents as well as which ones I should build in. And there's a couple of ways you could have solved that. Number one, we could have used a templated set of intents by vertical. So let's say you're in the banking industry and you're buying our chatbot management platform. It'll come preloaded with banking intents, generic banking intents, for example, and same might be for other industries. But that depended on a couple of things. Like, number one, it depended on more subject matter expertise and some more data on what those common banking intents are, of which we didn't really have the answers to right now. The other thing we were exploring was looking at using machine learning to suggest intents from a transcript. Kind of like using, and my machine learning knowledge isn't too sharp here, but using topic modeling to comb through all your chat logs that you have from the past and then suggest what are the common topics that it pulls out of what are those common intents. So that's something we're exploring right now, and we're actually in the process of going through and building out this feature. But looking at what we did, well, we looked at, number one, like which data we had available, and we actually had some contact center transcripts from some of our beta customers, and they're willing to provide us with those. And then our data science team looked at those transcripts, and with that, they're able to see, can we use topic modeling to pull out, some intents which we can then suggest to our customers. Then we're trying to understand, would that be useful, and how much time does it end up solving or saving for our customers? And we found that this would be a useful and valuable feature. From there, I think our next steps really are to measure the impact of using this approach. So we've got quantitative feedback that, and with a few people, it'll save them a significant amount of time, enough so for us to proceed with this feature. But I think when we release this to live and have a lot more customers using it, then we're going to start to see, is this really solving and working towards those success metrics, such as the time it takes to find which intents that they need to include in their chatbot. And then maybe later on, we might see some other metrics improve, such as containment rate. And then obviously there's a discussion about whether that's relevant or not and useful. And then also the time to resolve a customer contact to get their issue resolved. So this is the approach that we took with our constraints, especially given the B2B nature and the stage of development of which our product is at. And yeah, so our next steps really are to try and get something out there into more and more customers' hands to get more data to start evaluating and maybe touching on things like what you had mentioned earlier and trying to see if we can solve some of those problems. Because this sounds super interesting. So that's this piece. I think I had one more question over here around our discussion points. And this is probably the last open forum discussion, and then we can wrap up the presentation from there. But some discussion points I had for us to talk about are, how do we choose some of those success metrics? Like, so for us, it was looking at the time that a chatbot product manager spends building up their chatbot intent set. How does data science impact your product feature approach? So this is where, let's say we put that feature out there and we get a lot of data back, and maybe we find that the approaches that we took are not working, or maybe not using machine learning, but more so just analyzing the data. Was this feature useful, and did it deliver the value that we're looking for? Other discussion points we can open up to is, how does data science impact your agile loop? I guess we covered that one already. And then data science interacting with strategy. But I think at this point, I'll open it up with some questions. Did you remember any other questions you wanted to add?
I asked a few. I was going to add, a lot of this is within the framework of assuming an agile methodology. And I think, if you're working for a larger company, which I think some people here might, I don't know if they use agile frameworks. And so how would this kind of all fit into a different type of workflow, whether it's waterfall or anything else that's maybe not so agile?
So anyone working in waterfall here and would like to speak to that? Yeah, awesome. I kind of baited you into that. But yes.
Well, I don't know that I have any particular golden nuggets. In terms of how we go about choosing our success metrics, then a lot of the times the executives have a certain idea that they want to implement. They'll engage our team usually at the strategy point, and that's when we'll start to say these are the business outcomes that we want to drive with the product. And as we go through, part of why I asked about what a prototype for an eventual production model would look like was because at least how we go about delivering, we only can get something in front of the business for them to evaluate what the actual outcome might look like very late on. And at that point, if the results aren't looking that great, then a lot of time has been invested and there's a lot of reluctance, or a lot of faith is lost in our team from them. So maybe the agile approach where you have more iterative checkpoints can help to mitigate that. But in terms of waterfall, I'd love to hear if anyone else has experience or insights to share on mitigating those risks.
I had a lot of conversations about that when I was working at a consulting company where I went through the cycle a lot. And I don't think this is going to help you per se, but I think we struggled a lot to see how you could do it in any way that wasn't, not strictly agile, you have to change a lot of definitions of things, but just because it's science, you have hypotheses and you test them and you don't know what your results are going to be until you've tried it and run an experiment, and it's really hard to push it into waterfall. And good luck, Eric.
The other thing, I'm unable to answer your question in terms of waterfall, but I'll add another, I'll throw another wrench into the mix. When your customers are external, they expect a certain breadth and feature set. So you have to build up a bunch of other value propositions in your product, and then and only then can you get it into their hands and start capturing data and then validating those hypotheses that you have. Perhaps on the internal side, I think I'll open up to some of our RBC folks in the room. I would think it's easier because you don't, I don't know, is there a initial market release or minimum feature requirements that you need to put out there before you can start capturing data from them? The value exchange is different there, no?
Yeah, it depends. So it depends on which part of what type of product you're working on in the bank. So some of them are too core or back end the customer would never see. So the customer of those products are different parts of the bank itself.
Yeah, your internal stakeholders.
Yeah. But even for those, usually what happens is that you start having some sort of let's take that NLP that Amir suggested earlier on. So some sort of a product that generally does what it does. Let's say machine translation, for example. It's not perfect for the specific domain, but once you put it in production, then it starts gathering data. And then you can go and refine the results. Some manual, if you're using the supervised machine learning paradigm, inevitably you'll have some manual sort of tagging process. Now there are ways to reduce that effort. Does that answer your question to some extent?
Well, my question was more so like, given that your customers are internal for some of these projects, that you don't have to deliver as much other stuff, packaging it like icing on the cake. You can just get right to like the meat of it, and you can give them that one piece. Yeah. So a lot of times, I'm a proponent of a complete product. So you want your product to have an interface, to be feasible to work with and pleasant. But a lot of times that's correct, yes. A lot of times it's not going to go to a customer per se, but a software engineer team of a different business. And what's going to happen over there, I mean, it still translates. Like you still want it to be consistent. You want it to deliver what it says it delivers, but the interface would be just an API that they can call. So that's kind of that's a little bit different from where you have a chatbot, a customer facing. That's a person outside the business.
I think we should have a session just on a startup versus a big company. I'm serious. Because that's a very interesting topic.
It is, yeah.
Does anyone else come from, let's say, or we already asked about the big businesses. Does anyone else come from startups out here that'd like to comment on the challenges that you face with data?
I was just answering the first half of that question. Do you work at a startup? So I put my hand up. Pause for the rest of the question. But I could answer the latter half.
Yeah, sure. Like what kind of challenges you face in your
The problem with a lot of the data that I have at my company is there is a bit of a bias or a skew because the internal team could impact the final results. So being able to take that into account has proved challenging in some aspects.
Can you give me some more detail? Like tell us a little more about an example though?
So part of what we do is we represent like a roster of people that a brand could use to advertise. Okay. And the problem with that roster is the internal team would pick and choose who they like. And part of my job is being able to automate that aspect of presenting a roster without having to use the internal team. But so much of our historical data has been impacted by their own personal decisions.
Right.
So that's what I meant. Does that clarify?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I find it really helpful. And then, so big companies, I guess, don't really come across some of the same challenges, or how do you find that?
I think big companies do. If they say they don't, they're lying to themselves.
Is there a question in the back?
Yeah.
Sorry,
I was just thinking about what I can say. I work at a startup that's also big. I would say.
Has it raised any money recently?
It has just raised a lot of money. And I would say that exact challenge is a really huge one. The question of how do you develop a product, like if your end goal is to develop a product that will work for multiple customers, how do you get there? And the like, do you build first for one specific use case and then make it generalized so that it can be a product, or can you go straight to product without doing that first? I think it is a big problem, and I think it often does require a lot of like early access partner sort of development, or like anything where you're partnering, where you, to some extent, you have to build for one use case before you can, and that requires, like getting the data requires some sort of partnership with your company, and then that's the whole legal IP thing is like very complicated.
Yeah, actually, that's something we faced at Filament started out as a consulting business with very large clients. And the reason we built our platform is because we faced problems in building these clients' chatbots that we thought we could solve and increase our margins if we had a product. But because we were able to leverage some of those large clients' data to at least get our first MVP of our product out there, it was a big, big help. I think without it would have been very, very complicated. Then we're looking at some of the situations I think that you'd mentioned earlier, which is, can we give a free tool out there that can help us capture some data, and then only after that point, then we build out the rest of our product. It's one.
Or can you solve some of the actually really interesting AI questions that involve representation learning and transfer learning and whatever to build for one client and then find something that you can generalize without breaking IP agreements to build something else.
Yeah, so there are companies, startup companies, if you like, that actually work in the domain of data access, data management, and masking data. So it's a big challenge if you want to collaborate. If you need some data to offer better product, either company they don't want to give away their IP, right? So you have to have a mechanism, and it happens. I believe across the board, in between startups as well as bigger organizations, and I believe that's a real product. I know quite a few, I think 5 companies, if you 2 or 3 in the city that are actually working in the domain. I wanted to also use that as a segue to add that there is a distinction that I can sometimes see between smaller companies and bigger enterprises, and it is that sometimes bigger enterprises are much more under scrutiny. So there is they have to kind of move slower. They have layers of checks and balances to go through before they can do something. And if they do something wrong, rightfully so, they'll be criticized heavily because everybody knows them. And so it's a matter of trust. If you're a startup, you get some leeway. You can break things a couple of times and then get back on your feet until you're good. The issue that was pointed out, you pointed out earlier on with the startup, is that sometimes it's harder to get data, and it's vital. I have waited for data for months, and that's in a startup in a past life, and that can really you can't do anything without it. You have to see it. Your solution may be entirely useless otherwise. So that's a real challenge there. You don't have it usually when inside a bigger company. You don't have that challenge, but then there are regulations that you have to go through. So I think there are distinctions, but similar problems.
So I come from a big company, insurance company, and in our scenario, our AI data, all of that world has started 2.5 years ago. We have a lot of data, but accessing that data and identifying where they are was our biggest challenge. So our team was spending 5, 6, 7 months at the beginning to just identify, let's say, the 17 sources of the data that they needed, because a portion of it would be on his PC, a portion of it would be on his PC. So then a portion of our team turned into a data transformation project to build a data mart and data lakes. And that's so that, when somebody wants to build a tool that, builds 7 models, they're not spending 90% of their time just going to be we have this data, where in the world can it possibly be? But that's
That's fair enough. That's a real problem.
That's an interesting conflict to have, because I work at a startup and we have the same problem. But so it's really reassuring that even bigger, more established places still run into the same thing.
But even your last example was that your historical information is biased, basically. We have similar problem with one of my products. is that the last tool they had is about 25 years old, and it was 25% of the time correct. So I don't even know why they kept this tool. So the people that were using the tool were pretty much just feeding the information in the tool when they were pretty much like 90% sure that it was going to be right. So the accuracy of that tool was like 80% right when it was getting the information, and they're like, you need to be better than this. And we're like, you're taking 100%, our tool 100% of the time, and you're taking this guy 25% of the time. But it's very much like, we're not, like, we're looking at the performance of that tool, we're looking at the performance of ours, but also looking at what does reality actually look like, and what can we compare to that, and what really doesn't make sense for us to compare it all.
Starting to feel like some data problems are universal.
Yeah, but also I think it's also related to how you doing the data governance. Who actually the group who initially creating the data, storing could be a legacy system or some new data lakes or some new platforms. How they continue to manage and to be have a better governance rules process to regulating ensure the data quality. Because again, I think it's a very because the data quality controlling your model upper bound. If you have a better quality, it's like if like you give some rotten bad tomato to some Michelin chef, nothing they can do with it, right? So I guess for the data team itself, when you're taking any of the data, it have to have a sanity check to ensure the upstream is clean.
Yeah, but it's
very
fairly new thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I also sit in the big enterprise. We're facing the same things, especially when you're taking, for example, when you're trying to make some good meal, you don't want to go to the farms, right? You want somebody bring you something, have sitting all the raw materials sitting well in the Walmart with a good quality control. But sometimes it doesn't. You have to go there and check with the farmers. How you raise your chickens? Is it good? Is it good quality? Are they happy or something like this? Is like This is eventually I think there's some sort of they need to find a way to have a clear responsibility for taking that kind of piece.
Yeah, that's true. So sometimes you build your, just say that quickly, sometimes you build your data lake, so even enterprises, so Arbis is pretty advanced in that. Endeavor, they built we have a couple of data lakes that we use. We probably arguably have more that other lines of businesses also use. Sometimes if something gets missed early on, and it's very likely, then you have to go back to the farmers, as you pointed out, to know. So you look at the other thing is that the data is so massive that maybe it doesn't directly speak to chatbots, but for some of the problems, it's very hard. It takes you months, if not I don't know, if not years, to understand the entire picture. So you would have you have your data stores, you have your data owners to go to and ask, hey, what is actually going on in the data for product idea to get initiated.
So we're close to closing the session, so I want to encourage those who haven't asked questions to ask questions in the next few minutes.
I have a comment. So
you have asked questions.
I didn't have any comment.
Smart.
So anyone can go
on.
Well, I wanted to just point out that like working as in a big company, so usually the scenario is that they have some data collected already, and it doesn't have the good quality probably. So that's why I think what they have done in our company, so they've decided to put together some kind of I don't know how to collect data, right? So because it can serve different purposes. So if you have all of them kind of written, then when they collect the data, then they can collect it in a way that you can kind of serve all of those needs. Otherwise,
same way.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about, let me ask the question for in terms of any other questions, especially on the conversational AI side. Do we have any other questions? What are some things that you guys are interested in the field, or what do you see is working well, not working well?
I have a question. So, what is your take if we, do you think that chatbots can replace websites?
Replace websites.
Like
I think it depends on the goal for the website, and also I'll ask you to jump in here too, so I think you have some thoughts. I think it depends on the goal for the website. Like it depends on, what's the website's purpose. Chatbots are well suited to a few specific use cases, but if your website has a lot of information that you want a reader to use, I don't think a chatbot is the best way of delivering that, especially given like a small window. There's just so much text you can fit in. I think chatbots are good if it depends on the way you design it too. A lot of it is the conversation design. If you design it so that the user knows what they're getting into, like they know what to ask, and they know what they can ask the chatbot for, I think then you can start to replace some more websites. But I've been onto some websites where like the home page is a chatbot and it says like ask me anything. I oftentimes feel lost, and I hear other people just feel lost. You don't know what you can ask the chatbot. Do you have any other thoughts you want to add there, Mike?
I mostly agree with you. I think that it depends on what the website is for and the function. And I come from it from a perspective of like language, thinking about language a lot, and it's really useful because it's like this perfect medium that we have, this channel that we like don't have to think about at all, and we can express like virtually like any concept we want. But we also know there's a lot of limitations, and we've invented a lot of like technological things, and not just like electronics, but graphs, charts, and tables, all sorts of stuff to represent information in ways that like language is like very bad at conveying, right? And I think that just once again, depending on the purpose, that language is really good for describing complex scenarios and concepts. But like if I want to pick a seat on an airplane, like please don't describe to me like I want to sit like kind of like 3/5 of the way back and like near the restroom. Like that's so inefficient, right? Like a visual interface is very nice for that, and I think a good chatbot is really good at some things in language, and how you want to marry that with using what other channels are really good for is kind of like the more interesting question.
And in terms of language, just to follow up, have you thought about like making it multilingual or something? Like, what are the challenges that you can face?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of demand from especially enterprise companies for their chatbots to be multilingual, and there are a lot of problems. And I think one of the big ones is just like your data. If you're trying to have native training in a non-English language, the amount of data you can get is just
person, I guess.
and then like exactly. So like, where is the data coming from, and then how are you validating it? Do you have like native speakers to check somewhere like that it's working all right if you do audits? And so there's a lot of issues, and I think there's a lot of demand for it as well. So everyone's trying to make it.
Yeah, we've also come across some of those requests. Also, we find we can rely on third parties, like Dialogflow does understand multiple languages. And respond, but you have to key in your own response in the language that you want to say. You had a question?
Yeah, so to piggyback up on your point a little bit, I think in a case like the websites that you mentioned where it's just basically a chat bot, I think that can be a little bit over-engineered. And I think if you're going to build a product, you're ultimately building a product for a person or for a user, for a client, and you have to keep them in mind. So something like a website that's just basically a chatbot, in some scenarios, maybe you're just over-engineering something and it's not exactly good design. And I think part of our job here is to make sure that we effectively deliver what the product is to the user.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Actually, so for more context, when I was looking at chatbot competitors' websites, oftentimes they had a chatbot on the homepage. So I guess they're trying to sell their product. But it's still, like, as a buyer of a chatbot, I don't think it was the most effective homepage. It was just boundless, essentially. I didn't know what I could ask. Yeah.
Just a statement. I think chatbots are really good on websites to augment the experience rather than being the center of it. Especially when it comes to complex stuff. It's very hard to illustrate that in a small, maybe a graph, chart, whatever. But having that ability to go more in depth if needed without cluttering up the page, I think is a very good use case for it.
On that great note, let's close the session. Let's thank Hirsch, Mike, and Essa.